Rational Wellness Podcasters. Dr. Ben Weitz here. I'm so glad you could join me today for another episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast. Each week, I'll be bringing you the latest cutting-edge information on health and nutrition. In this media-driven world, it's easy to be confused about what's true and what's not. I'll cut through the conflicting headlines to bring you clarity, to help you optimize your health and maximize your life. Please subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. None of the information in this podcast is intended to diagnose any condition, and this podcast is not intended to substitute for going to see your medical doctor and getting sound medical advice. So let's get started on your path to better health.
You think just finding its way in Leon.
So welcome everybody. So glad to be with you again for another episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast. I'm so happy to have Mike Mutzel here with me. He's our special guest for today, and he's got a lot of great information. Mike has a BS in biology, a master's in nutrition, and he's certified by the Institute of Functional Medicine. He's also the author of a best-selling book called The Belly Fat Effect, which I highly recommend. It has a lot of great information on ways to help you to lose weight besides simply reducing your calories and exercising. Not that those aren't important. And Mike also has a very successful podcast called High Intensity Health. And you can subscribe to that on iTunes and YouTube. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Great. Excellent. So I wanted to have you on this podcast, not only because you've written and spoken about some very interesting strategies to improve health, but you also practice what you preach and you keep yourself in great shape. I've seen that picture of your abs, which is something I've always prided myself on as well. I know that some people do and some people are better at teaching, but I've always had a hard time when somebody who, not to disparage him, but when somebody who looks like Dr. Phil is trying to tell me how to eat. Mm-hmm. So I know you've spoken about how you found yourself at one point in your life doing an excessive amount of bicycling and how you lost more weight than you wanted to and found out that doing too much cardio was actually adversely affecting your health. Can you explain your story and then maybe let us know what kind of exercise routine that you're presently engaged in?
Yeah, that's brilliant. I think, to be the change that you want to see in the world, you really need to kind of emulate, and live that lifestyle. I think it's really important. So, great point there. So right now I lift weights, 4 to 5 days a week. I do like cardio. I think, cardio can be a great way to get outside, be in nature. You really think about a lot of things, but I don't make that my bread and butter fitness approach. I think, when it comes to maintaining lean muscle mass, burning fat, the best strategy is resistance training, weights, and so forth. But I think overall, it's really good for people to figure out what gets them into a flow state and work on that when it comes to fitness. So, if yoga gets you into that flow state and you really like it and it takes your mind off, work and life stressors and so forth, do that. That's amazing. But I personally love lifting weights, and then I do ride my bike periodically, but I don't bike race like I used to. I used to train 25 hours a week. I wanted to be a professional and raced with pros and do all that sort of stuff, and realized that just led me to, burn muscle, you get real lean and all that. But if you look at cyclists and endurance athletes, they are, in my opinion, they don't have a lot of lean muscle mass, and it's not very healthy. So I decided that really probably wasn't the best approach, although I do love the competitive nature of bike racing and still miss it, and just actually did a bike race a few weeks ago and really liked it. But I don't want that to be my full-time thing and have it become imbalanced. But so through bike racing, figured out this whole thing about adrenal fatigue, and that's kind of how I got into this functional medicine space back in 2006, and realized that overtraining can have a huge impact on hormones and gut health and everything else. And so I think overtraining can be just, on the spectrum of, excessive stress and excessive life load and burden and so on. And so I think that's a huge aspect of health that people need to appreciate when it comes to body composition, is just life load and stress and obligations and so forth. And so whether it's overworking, overtraining, overdoing anything can present with a huge problem. But if we were to just take a scale back and say, okay, what should people be doing for exercise? I think you can't go wrong with a little yoga, walking outside, and trying to do at least resistance training 3 days a week, preferably 4. But this doesn't have to be going to the gym. This can be things that you can be doing in your home. And, things like, I like to break it up into like upper body pushing, lower body pushing, in terms of legs and so forth. And then upper body pulling, lower body pulling. So kind of that posterior chain for the glutes and so on. So.
Cool. What about a client who says to you, I just like doing yoga. And you know what? Yoga does everything for me. It gets me stronger. And by the way, this is typically a woman who, can wrap her legs twice around her neck and is the most flexible person on earth. And probably the last thing she really needs is more stretching. But that's what she's good at. So that's all she wants to do. What do you say to her?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think yoga can do a lot, right? But we're talking like isometric contractions for extended period of time, like, a warrior 2 pose. I personally do yoga pretty much every morning for about 20 minutes. I have a routine that I do, but that's like more for my mental state and that mind-body connection. It's really good for gut health. I mean, you're stretching out your internal organs and increasing blood flow and parasympathetic response. I mean, it's really good for that. But, you need a little bit more of that high intensity stuff to really cause adaptations within your muscle tissue. And so I think, the breakthroughs in yoga, like you talked about, really come through stretching and kind of the mental state. But if you want to have a breakthrough in your physique, you really need to I don't know how to say this more politely, but kind of beat your muscle up a little bit when it comes to resistance training to cause that adaptation, which will have a lot of carryover when it comes to aging gracefully and preventing diabetes and so on.
Great. I've heard you recommend that you like clients exercise in the morning, and you also think that it's a benefit to have a cup of coffee or some caffeine to maximize fat burning. Do you remember the ephedra caffeine aspirin stack that was so popular about 15, 20 years ago? I recall trying it, and I was like profusely sweating in the car before I even got to the gym. So It wasn't good for me. And eventually, they pulled that ephedra stuff off the market.
Yeah, it was hydroxycut.
Right. There were a whole bunch of different products on the market. Yeah. So you also recommend branched chain amino acids, especially leucine, to promote muscle building, because these are some of the aminos that are utilized by muscle. And you also mentioned that they stimulate M-TOR, which, I know for our non-practitioners listening is a little complicated, but you also don't recommend L-glutamine at the same time. Can you explain a little bit about some of the benefits of taking branched chain amino acids and what it means to stimulate M-TOR, and why you don't also recommend taking L-glutamine?
Yeah, no, just to provide some kind of clarification, I think glutamine is great to have in your diet, but when you're supplementing with leucine, you don't want glutamine to be in the same mixture at the same time. And that's research at Baylor University. Dr. Wolf has done a lot of human clinical studies when it comes to looking at preventing age-related and inflammatory-related muscle loss in the context of sarcopenia or cachexia and so forth. And if the threshold is around 3 grams of leucine, kind of that bolus of leucine, which can stimulate the gas pedal that we know in our body to be kind of the M-TOR, the muscle protein synthesis. M-TOR is kind of a pro-growth signal. But specifically in the muscle, it can enhance muscle protein synthesis. In other cells, it can cause aberrant responses in cancer and whatnot. So it's important that we talk about M-TOR in the context of muscle signaling, because there's insulin-induced M-TOR signaling throughout the body as well. And so that's where people say, wait, if you have cancer or you've had cancer before, you shouldn't have M-TOR signaling. And it's like, well, we want the stimulus from either leucine or resistance training, not from milk and milkshakes, right? So if we have a lot of dairy products and a lot of insulin signaling, that's going to stimulate M-TOR and other tissues in the body, which is not necessarily a good thing. So muscle-specific M-TOR stimulation is key. We're going to get that from resistance training, from that stimulus, and or from our diet, like high leucine containing foods, animal products, whey protein, or branched-chain amino acids, as you mentioned. So that bolus, that stimulus will help our muscles and myocytes to grow and repair so that we can adapt better to future exercise bouts, which is what we're trying to do. I mean, that's when we go to the gym, that's what we're trying. We're trying to like stretch the muscle to the point, not literally stretch it, but like cause an overreaching type situation so that the muscle adapts and becomes bigger and stronger and so forth. And that has a lot of health benefits with that. And so that's one stimulus. The leucine is another one. So yeah, I do recommend that either intra-workout or post-workout, but just take it when you think about it. Some people get all confused. Well, should I do it pre-workout? I mean, Joe Blow said it's really good pre-workout. It's like, just take it when you remember it. The studies are kind of mixed, but a lot of studies have shown like intra-workout or post-workout, and sometimes even before bed. And the thing with the branched-chain amino acids, like we kind of talked about with the glutamine, is you want to take them away from other proteins because there's other proteins in the mix, including glutamine. There can be some competitive absorption there. So that's why I recommend there. But a lot of people, particularly as they age, the signals and the ability to stimulate muscle and muscle protein synthesis declines with age. So this may not be super essential for a 16-year-old athlete that's eating a good diet, but someone that's in their 40s, 50s, or 60s that's trying to prevent inflammatory and or age-related muscle loss, this could be really essential. And the thing, and that's important to underscore because, myself, in high school and my buddies and stuff, when we would play football and on the football team, like we'd always have protein shakes in the car and protein shakes after working out. Like we took it really seriously. And then, my parents and, uncles and stuff, when they would go to the gym, they would just not think about eating. They would go get a latte after, but as the older you get, the more important it becomes to really make sure that you're supplementing with protein and eating a really clean diet, because that signal, like everything else with age, kind of diminishes. So I think that's important for people listening. And the key here is if people don't get the benefits or if they don't see any change from the gym, they're not going to stick with the program. And so that's why I recommend, particularly for people that are new to this, get the branched chain amino acids, take a little caffeine so that when you go to the gym, that pain response and kind of that mental exertion is diminished a little bit, so you can work out harder and it doesn't feel as painful to you when you have a little bit of caffeine. So I like to recommend these tools because it will help people get better results. And the more progress they see, the more likely they will be to make it a lifelong habit, not just, oh, it's spring, I need to lean up for my vacation kind of thing. It's like, we want this to be a lifestyle that's permanent.
Yep. Absolutely. Hey, what do you think about antioxidants? That's another controversial topic. I know a lot of us, I know I take plenty of antioxidants to, help with anti-aging and to protect my cells. And a number of years ago, I don't remember how many, maybe 15, 20 years ago, Dr. Cooper, who was like one of these experts at aerobic training, he had this book and he said, aerobic training just creates massive amounts of free radicals. And we really need a lot of antioxidants to mop that up, or it's going to create all sorts of tissue damage. And then there's other studies showing that, part of the way exercise causes our body to adapt is through free radical reactions. And if you take a bunch of antioxidants, you'll block the benefits you get from exercise. So where do you come down on the antioxidant thing? And is it a good idea to take antioxidants maybe at a different time of day or before or afterwards, or maybe you can comment on that?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's all context specific. And I think this notion that we just take nutrients whenever we want to is kind of becoming obsolete as we better understand the body's circadian rhythms and so forth. And so there's an interesting study that we can extrapolate actually of all animals, hummingbirds. They found that the hummingbirds' endogenous, meaning their self-produced antioxidants, were highest when their metabolic rate was the lowest while they're sleeping. And so researchers have started to look at this. So probably the best time to take antioxidants would be before going to bed. and then in the evening. So when our metabolic rate kind of slows down and our body's in a reparative type state, we know that our liver is very active and secreting things like glutathione and upregulating various enzymes while we're sleeping. And so I think that's what I've been doing for a while, since reading this paper. I think it was published in 2013. But before that, a key influencer in our integrative functional medicine space, Jonathan Wright, had been recommending oral S-acetyl Glutathione before bed. And he actually looks at urinary growth hormone levels and urinary hormones. He has his clinic and then also Meridian Valley Laboratory, which is a laboratory connected to his clinic. So he does a lot of personal testing, and he found that supplementing with S-acetyl Glutathione, so glutathione is a great antioxidant detoxifier made by our liver and other cells in our body. And by taking glutathione at night, this oral glutathione, he found that it increased growth hormone, and it kind of restored the HPA axis. So I think that's the message there is yes, exercise induces free radical stress for sure. Just eating induces free radical stress. So does that mean that we always need to take antioxidants? Maybe, but preferably at night. And like you said, some of the adaptive signals that occur from moving muscle and exercising are mediated by these free radicals. So we need them there. We don't want to blunt them. We don't want to take vitamin C while we're training because that may affect things. And so it's funny. There's actually some products in the endurance market space that are touted to be antioxidants while you exercise. They contain SOD, superoxide dismutase and catalase and glutathione precursors. And, I'm thinking when that came out, I'm thinking they're not up on the research. The research is showing that those free radicals are needed to cause the adaptations to make you faster and stronger. So yeah, it's a very confusing space, I think, for people in general, because, they hear free radicals are bad, then antioxidants must be good. So, but again, it's this context and looking at the body through the lens of the circadian clock system and realizing that, antioxidants from a supplemental standpoint may be best given at night.
Yeah, that sounds good. I have to say, I take, a lot of my supplements when I have right after I finish my breakfast and then, with dinner. But breakfast is always the most consistent time to take them because it's before you really start your day. And then once you're running around, it's hard to get them in. So yeah. I tend to work out in the morning and then I plow down all my supplements and with breakfast. So
cool.
Anyway,
yeah.
So are there any other supplements that you think can have a benefit, building muscle or getting stronger, or, what about alkaline creatine, or are there any others that you think are beneficial?
Yeah, I think creatine can be huge, and there's all the different. There's the crealkaline, like you mentioned. There's creatine monohydrate. I think we're not getting enough creatine from our diet, and creatine's been shown. Supplemental creatine has a lot of benefits for cognition and brain health, and maybe slowing down age-related cognitive decline. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Beta alanine can help too. Pre-workout. That kind of helps with that pump and so
nitric
forth.
oxide.
Yeah, it seems to help with that. So
what about citrulline and some of the other nitric oxide stimulators?
I think those are good too. Absolutely. The issue with some of the kind of pre-workout stuff in the retail space is it's kind of a dirty marketplace in the sense that there's a lot of synthetic sweeteners and stabilizers and coloring agents. So you just want to find a clean brand. That's all I'd recommend. And I personally don't know. I haven't found one. I know MRM has a few products. They're based out of Riverside, California, I believe. But yeah, so just look for that. A lot of the sports nutrition space, the manufacturers and the people running those companies, they don't really care about sucralose and aspartame and food coloring number 450, whatever. So look for that because those have endocrine disrupting effects, which we don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I work with some professional cyclists and they come in with these drinks that they're taking. It's unbelievable, the artificial colors and sweeteners, and they're terrible. But, I think most of the professional brands now that we carry in our offices are starting to have a limited line of sports type supplements, and those are usually a lot cleaner.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
point.
So you mentioned one more thing on the supplements. You mentioned, would you mention beta alanine, and that has to do with the alkalinity and acidity and all that. That helps make your system more alkaline. What do you think about that whole concept of trying to make your system more alkaline so you can resist lactic acid and possibly push performance that way?
Yeah, there's some interesting clinical studies with beta alanine, and it gets converted to carnosine in the body and things like that, right? So, and I believe, like you mentioned, the main mechanism there is to help to buffer lactic acid. So that can be kind of a rate limiting, as lactic acid builds up under like real short duration, high intensity exercise, that causes you to feel to literally to burn, the muscles feel like the burn. But part of that, lactic acid is also a signaling molecule in and of itself. And so it may have some adaptive responses. So then it kind of comes into question, is it like taking the antioxidant while you're exercising? So part of me thinks, okay, this research is really cool and interesting. And then the other part of me is like, well, wait, if this is a signaling molecule, do we really want to buffer lactic acid and so on? But that being said, I think I've taken beta alanine on and off for years, and it adds this interesting kind of fuzzy feel, almost like when you take niacin, pure nicotinic acid, and you feel like you can just get a better pump when you're working out. So even if it's placebo mediated, whatever, I feel like it does offer some benefits. But I think with the nitric oxide and the beta alanine, I think it's good to kind of cycle those in, maybe do 2 weeks on, 1 week off, or 3 weeks on, a week off, whatever. Don't do it consistently forever. In contrast, the amino acids, the creatine, the caffeine, I think you can do that, pretty consistently, especially on days that you train. So
yeah, the other supplement that a lot of the athletes are using now is beet juice.
Yeah.
And they have that, like 30 or 60 minutes before they exercise or run or something.
Yeah, that's been awesome. There's a beet kvass that a local company here in Seattle makes. It's like fermented with ginger and stuff like that. And so I've been buying that before training, only on really intense days. Like if I'm not doing something too, if it's just more of like a recovery day, that blast of 40 grams of sugar, probably not going to help me that much. But and it has a surprising, again, it could be placebo or not, but I do notice like more vascularity and kind of a better pump. So it's interesting.
Cool. So in your excellent book, Belly Fat Effect, which I highly recommend everybody get a hold of, you write about visceral fat. That's the fat around the middle. And we know that that fat cells in people who are overweight tend to be hypersensitive to inflammatory stress molecules. So what are some of the best strategies to reduce sick fat? And also, if sick fat is bad fat, then good fat is, our brown fat, which is metabolically active. And, what do you think about some of the strategies to try to improve brown fat?
Yeah. Brilliant. You cut out a little bit there, but I think I got the question.
I did. Part. Okay.
Yeah. It could have been just on my end. So just, you might have to redo some of that, but, it's really interesting. The different phenotypes or flavors and characteristics of fat tissue is really, really fascinating stuff. And, so I don't know if your listeners can notice, but I was shivering a little bit before this interview because one of my morning routines when I water the garden is to actually just spray myself down with the hose. And so it really has a huge effect on like kind of that cold induced thermogenesis and kind of the shivering and stuff. And so the downside there is you can be cold throughout the day, at least in the morning for me. But it has a huge, this brown adipose tissue induction and causing the beiging of the white fat to convert it to brown fat is really, at first it was just a lot of animal model studies, and now we're seeing a lot of human clinical data coming up, and kind of the crosstalk between insulin and brown adipose tissue and ketone formation, fat burning, and brown fat, I think is key. So one thing that, simple tip that everyone could do every day is at least end your shower with full cold. If you're not, don't have the guts, if you will, to just jump into a cold shower, then just like take your normal warm shower and just try to do 30 seconds and just spray down, particularly the back of the neck and kind of the head and things like that with cold water. And over time, you'll notice you'll become more and more resilient. And one thing that I personally do, this I'll go back to the
By the
inflammatory.
way, why the back of the neck? Is that where the brown fat is?
It is, yeah. I mean, in babies too. I mean, my daughter's 5 now. She's starting to get rid of it, but that's generally where we have a lot of the brown adipose tissue, and kind of under the lymph nodes here as well. So you'll notice, like, if for parents with young children, when babies just have a lot of loose skin back here, that's that brown adipose tissue. And you kind of activate, the barrel response and different responses. It's a real sensitive area, back of the neck and head and all that. So that being said, I was kind of losing my train of thought there. But yeah, so make sure that you do that once. It's coming back to me. So the mental state of just doing something that you don't really want to do every day. I mean, there's Olympic athletes that don't want to get up and train. There's bodybuilders, fitness models that don't want to go to the gym. So just forcing yourself to do something that you don't really want to do. And no one really enjoys a cold shower while they're in the midst of it, but we like it afterwards. So just the mental pursuit of jumping into a cold shower or dumping the hose on you in your garden has a lot of carryover in terms of that grit and that tenacity and kind of forcing yourself to do things that sometimes you don't really want to do. And so there's a lot of things we have to do as parents. Sometimes we don't want to do as, business owners, whatever. And so just that exercise, starting the day off with a little bit of a cold thermogenesis, cold shower is key. Actually, Tony Robbins, he does this. A lot of his homes, he talks about this. He has a home in Colorado and somewhere in the Sierra Nevadas, I believe. And he bought property near where there's like running water, cold water, so that every morning he can just jump into a cold water and it fires up his nervous system. So whether or not you're a Tony Robbins fan or not, it's hard to argue with his energy and his vitality. And I think there's a key element to that. So that's the brown adipose tissue. And we, like you talked about, a lot of Americans and people that have chronic disease have dysfunctional white adipose tissue. And so this is the other type of fat, particularly around the visceral area. Sometimes we get this in the back of the arms and so forth. But it turns out that fat is not this inert storage depot. I should say adipose tissue or fat tissue is not this just inert storage depot. It's really metabolically active, really immunologically active, and we see a dramatic increase in the number and types of immune cells. So what does this mean? Well, if you're carrying around excess fat, you're going to be predisposed to have more inflammatory-based diseases like asthma, like allergies, like autoimmunity, like depression, like neurologic disorders, cancer, you name it. So that should really encourage people to do things that help to burn fat better. And also, I like to incorporate some anti-inflammatory strategies in there as well. So it's not just about exercise and dropping your calories and all that sort of stuff. We need to focus, like we talked about earlier, food-based antioxidants, color-rich fruits, vegetables, herbs, spices can be key for combating this inflammation that we see. So that's a key element there. Vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids. So treat excessive body fat as though, for clinicians listening or people that want to, have a breakthrough, we need to look at obesity almost as though it's an autoimmune disease in a sorts. And the obesity actually meets 4 of the 5 defining criteria of an autoimmune disease. The only criteria that it doesn't meet is the antibody production against the adipocytes. So one characteristic of an autoimmune disease is the immune system will make antibodies that will destroy self-tissue, like Hashimoto's in the thyroid, right? There's antibodies made against the thyroid. So that's the only, out of the 5 defining criteria, the 5 hallmarks of an autoimmune disease, obesity meets 4 of the 5. And so again, to change the landscape, the paradigm through which we view weight loss, we need to kind of consider the immune system. And so we're seeing this more and more. Now, that being said, let's just talk about simple things people can do to lose weight. Well, if we talk about, we need to burn more fat for fuel. Because we have excess stored body fat, so we need to burn it somehow. The best fat burning strategy is to just increase the health of your muscle through like the things we talked about, resistance training, even things like yoga can be helpful, but you need to get into the gym and move those muscles and go to failure. And the more healthy you can get your muscle by increasing mitochondrial density and vascularity and hypertrophy, the more fat you can burn and the higher your resting metabolic rate will be. So it's kind of interesting, and a lot of research just keeps emerging and showing even in children, even in children as young as 6, there's an infiltration of all these immune cells within the fat tissue itself. And so there's a lot of crosstalk between the immune system and fat tissue, even in animals. And if you look at, kind of not prehistoric, but primitive animals and things like fruit flies and Drosophila, things that are studied a lot in science to get a basic understanding. The immune system within flies and primitive animals is also their adipose tissue. It's one and the same. It's the same organ. So Harvard researchers, since discovering this back in like 1990, have created this term meta-inflammation, and this idea that our metabolism and our immune system are linked and cross-talking and so forth. So if we have metabolic dysregulation, insulin resistance, obesity, diabetes, if we have that, we're going to have immune dysregulation. And when we have immune dysregulation, that really causes us to be predisposed to autoimmunity and chronic inflammatory diseases. So hopefully this will provide people with a little more fire under their butts to get out and lose the weight, because again, that weight sitting around particularly the abdomen is really increasing your risk for diseases that are going to cause a lot of poor quality of life going forward.
Cool. You wrote in one of your articles that a high-fat diet, in your book, you wrote that a high-fat diet results in certain endotoxins being released that results in inflammation. And how does this square with other research that shows that a high-fat ketogenic diet, at least for some people, can be anti-inflammatory and can reduce inflammatory cytokines?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Ben. Thanks for asking that. So it's really high animal fat and then again, I'm not totally opposed to high animal fat at all. We eat grass-fed beef and things like that, bacon periodically. But it's important to understand the context through which we eat a ketogenic diet or intentionally have low-carb, high-fat diet, because if we're putting just tons of butter in our coffee and butter on everything and not having those plant-based, color-rich, phytonutrient, flavonoid type compounds, we can inadvertently absorb bacterial endotoxin. And so this is a key theme of the book that I talked about. And full disclosure, I intentionally, the whole ketogenic diet thing back when I wrote that in 2012 was not on my radar whatsoever. And I've since, I've studied it quite extensively over the last few years. So I'm in the midst of kind of redoing that to clarify that particular point that you brought up. But yeah, so suffice it to say, when we absorb saturated animal fats, have a diet rich in these compounds, we're inadvertently absorbing bacterial fragments called endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide. And those are very pro-inflammatory and can ignite all these inflammatory switches in our body, TNF alpha and interleukin 6 and interferon gamma. These are all known as cytokines and inflammatory signaling molecules for folks. And that can really take you right out of fat burning. That can slow down ketone body formation, what we know as hepatic ketogenesis. So, it's important to understand. But in contrast, if you were to have bacon and a lot of butter and all the low-carb, high-fat foods that people are promoting, but you have that, say, with polyphenols like rosemary, basil, ginger, garlic, onions, leeks, like you mix in those compounds, you can prevent that endotoxin from being absorbed and mitigate some of that damage. So I think it's really important for people that we don't lose sight of the big picture and keep the end goal in mind. And that's overall health, not at the expense of you don't want to be, to burn fat at the expense of becoming more inflamed or affecting your bacterial diversity or your microbiome diversity and so forth. So that's the thing to focus on. So if you're going to do a low carb, high fat diet, which I generally do recommend for a lot of people, make sure that you're kind of overcompensating with these polyphenolic rich compounds, fiber from vegetables primarily, and herbs and spices. Some of my favorites, like I mentioned, rosemary, tarragon, marjoram, basil, just mixing those in the diet as often as you can really help to mitigate that fat-induced inflammation.
Yeah, no, I know those spices. There's a ton of research on spices as being anti-inflammatory, anti-carcinogenic, really, really helpful.
Yeah.
What do you think about the whole, if we want to call it a diet debate, if you were to recommend one, I realize everybody's different and depending upon your circumstances, if you're pre-diabetic or if you have cancer, there's a million different circumstances and genetics and everything else. But sort of in general, what do you think about the the controversy over what's the healthiest diet. Do you generally prefer paleo or Mediterranean or vegetarian or?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I think it's hard to argue with eating what's seasonally available in your area where you live. Okay. So if you've been living in Southern California for 15 years or whatever, just go to your farmer, an organic, non-GMO farmer that don't spray pesticides, and say, okay, do you have a calendar of what's available? And just eat those foods. And so that for part of the year, that may be very low carb ketogenic. For part of the year, we're getting into summer, berries are coming into season, tubers are coming into season. That doesn't mean that we should starve ourselves and eat coconut year round, right? So we need, I think, it's really hard to argue with that. And so some of the year that may be more plant-based compounds than animal meats, right? Because it's not like cows are being slaughtered every month of the year. They come into season just like vegetables and are harvested in the fall. So that's what I generally recommend. We get eggs this time of year. We get eggs in the fall as well from chicken. So it makes sense then to probably eat eggs right now. And so that's what I personally, since we grow a lot of our own vegetables. And so that's, for me, that's what I've realized, like, hey, right now we have cucumbers and zucchini coming in. We have squashes coming in. So does it make sense to be full keto for me right now? If this is what's available, do I need to be having coconut products from Hawaii and all this all the time? Or maybe is that better in the winter and to be more ketogenic kind of in the winter when those vegetables are not in season and there's limited options, no berries. So that's what I have, and it may sound a little woo-woo, a little light and fluffy. I don't have clinical research supporting this, but to me, this seasonality, the diet, if you want to call it a season diet, makes a lot of sense. Now, if you live in Alaska or North Dakota, you're going to have to import some of your food probably, right? And in those individuals may eat more grains, right? Because they're harvesting grains and they can store them and so forth. I don't really know, but that's what I recommend to my clients, is just try to go low carb, particularly, if you're not very active, you don't need a lot of carbohydrates, and then eat whatever is seasonally available for you. And I don't know any health experts that would argue why that wouldn't be healthy for an individual, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Then you're supporting your local economy, your local farmers. You're not having food flown in from 3,000 miles all over the world. Like it makes more sense to me, and a big picture, it's good for the environment as well.
Well, I mean, you consider the average consumer, and they're so disconnected. They're going into their local grocery store, they're going into their Ralph's, or now they're going into their Amazon store, which is bought Whole Foods. They have no idea where the food's coming from or what season it is. Everything seems to be available all the time. So they have, no clue what's seasonal, what's not seasonal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know that that's a good thing. I don't know that having blueberries on Christmas Eve, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying it's bad. There's still antioxidants. There's still fruit. But, part of that, this hasn't been studied, but eating food out of season is a modern thing. Humans couldn't have done this 200 to 300 years ago, right? So I don't want to go back to those days. I'm not saying that, but I am providing, a thought that people should consider is eating out of season. Could that be contributing to the SIBO that we're seeing, the autoimmunity, all the bowel issues and so forth? I think it's an interesting thing that we need to explore more for sure.
Cool. So you just brought up SIBO. So I know we're going to be running out of time pretty soon. So I'm going to make one of the last questions about the gut. Mm-hmm. So you've written about some of the connections between the microbiota, which is all the healthy bacteria in our colon, and obesity. And you even, in your book, you mentioned a connection between one of the microorganisms that causes SIBO, or, SIBO is understood now in my understanding as to be the main cause of irritable bowel syndrome, is this particular organism called Methanobrevibacter smithii, which is basically this primitive sort of bacteria type thing, and obesity. And can you talk about that a little bit, and then some of the things that we can do to help address this, to help us get that extra fat off?
Yeah, really, really good question. I think there's multiple causes, of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and different bacterial levels. But like you mentioned, some of the sulfur reducing bacteria, the methanobacteria and so forth, that sulfur may slow down transit time and slow down motility. But there's a lot of new research coming out showing that bile dysfunction and lack of bile can, kind of be upstream of SIBO and cause these bacteria to overgrow and proliferate, because bile is in and of itself antimicrobial. So I think what we're seeing here is just a culmination of all these factors from, lack of bacterial diversity, which creates instability within the microbiome, lack of kind of north to south. Like we want digestion to be iterative, north to south, and kind of moving down the line. And when we have upstream dysfunction, like we're not even chewing our food, we're not being mindful, we're just swallowing foods, drinking smoothies, eating while we're on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, so we're not activating the cephalic phase of digestion. So then this whole north-south, this iterative and sequential process is being augmented. And then so we do see bacteria going from south to north, which we don't want, and poor motility. So I'm certainly not a SIBO expert at all, but there is a lot of research showing that by just chewing your food, being mindful, slowing down, making time for your meals, and activating that cephalic or brain-based digestive process can really stimulate bile flow, motility, hydrochloric acid, and can move, the proper, prevent bugs from accumulating and keep the sphincters tight and keep the tone in the GI tract tight. And so I think, that correlates again with less belly fat around the abdomen, a better blood sugar regulation, better post-meal processing of the nutrients, gut hormones are activated, and much more. So I like to make it very simple in that regard, because people can, I've worked with a lot of clients with SIBO, and they keep doing the elemental diet, and they do the antibiotics, they do rifaximin, they do berberine, and they're constantly chasing this thing around. And I think, maybe we're trying to overcomplicate it and look too much at all these different therapies and so forth, and not getting back to like, okay, well, what really caused this problem? Now, obviously, there's different medicines, opioids and proton pump inhibitors that can increase prevalence of SIBO. But, just there's so many different conditions that we can help by covering the basics. And even when I go to these functional medicine conferences and see 1,300 people eating lunch, a lot of people are checking their phones and and we just heard about the importance of gut health and so forth. So even as healthcare practitioners in the midst of all this, we need reminders to slow down and chew our food and be mindful. So certainly patients with no, professional training in this need that reminder even more so. And I think
That's great, Mike. So I understand that you're working on a new book. Can you
Yes.
tell us about that and when that would be released?
Yeah, January of 2018. So my wife and I, in the book Belly Fat Effect that you've been referencing,
Right.
I didn't put any recipes in there. It was intentional. A lot of health books nowadays, are like 20 pages of content and a bunch of recipes that some of the authors didn't even create themselves. They outsourced that to a recipe person. So I didn't want to put any recipes in there for that reason, but my wife and I have created a lot of like low carb ketogenic friendly recipes that are also healthy for the microbiome. And we've been experimenting and tinkering and testing for a long time. So yeah, we're in the final stages of kind of working on that and wrapping it up for a January launch. So that'll be exciting.
That'd be great. We'll be looking for that. And for patients or practitioners who'd like to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, just highintensityhealth.com. I'm pretty active on YouTube, my blog, in iTunes, like you mentioned, and on Facebook.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike.
My pleasure. This
Okay.
is fun.
Okay. Bye.